Hello. Welcome to the last day of SQL Bits, and welcome to my session, Migrating Data Solutions to the Cloud, a Checklist. My name is Christina Mishra. A quick background about me. I'm half Elven and generally aligned as chaotic good, unless it has to do with security, and then I'm lawfully neutral. Some of my titles include Paladin, Rogue, and Wizard, which is to say, all things data related. I've been a data professional for over 20 years. Some additional titles I've held are Data Architect, DBA, Consultant, Developer, Manager, and many more. Some of my favorite projects have been working for the CDC and several global health projects. Currently, I work for a wonderful company called Kent Corporation. I work for the headquarters, which hosts the shared IT services for all the Kent companies, and I am the lead data architect for our business intelligence and data analytics team, as well as a member of our Cloud Center of Excellence team. Some history of me in the community, since I tend to try to fly under the radar. I was a volunteer organizer for SQL Saturday in Atlanta for over 8 years and for the induction year for SQL Saturday BI. I hold cloud certifications with both Microsoft and AWS, and I have a bachelor's in information systems from Kennesaw State University and a master's in business analytics from ISU. I'm neurodiverse, so occasionally I may have trouble processing things said to me, or sometimes interruptions may completely throw me off. So generally speaking, I save questions to the end, time allowing. However, I do love answering questions. So if you have a question during the presentation, feel free to ask, and the moderator will have a list for me. Any questions we can't answer at the end, or if you just want to connect, feel free to contact me at LinkedIn, Twitter, or dataworkmom.com, and I will be happy to answer. So what is this session about today? This is our agenda, and we are going to go step by step with the items an organization needs to consider and include when migrating data solutions to the cloud. Why a checklist? I like checklists, like really like checklists. In my younger years, I sometimes made checklists about my checklists. This is something very calming about both the organization of a checklist and the physical checking things off. Plus, you get the added security of knowing exactly what has been done and what hasn't. Let's face it, this process goes on for months, sometimes years. You need to know where you are in the process at any given time, and a checklist can really help with that. Note that while this is a checklist, it is also an iterative process. You may gain some insight halfway through that changes how you need to process things steps before. So definitely don't think of this as a linear checklist, but more of a revolving checklist, always considering each step. Have I gained new information that changes things in this list? Because you may need to go back to a previous step if it does. What this presentation is not. It's not a deep technical dive into individual tools, technologies, or methods. That would require a full day course. There are so many great resources, some really great ones out there for this, including here at SQL Bits, that it just doesn't add anything for me to shorten my time by discussing them here. But don't worry, I won't leave you short. I will reference some of my favorite and well-known ones in this presentation, and then at the end, have a listing of resources for you to refer to. With that, let's get right to it. Pre-planning and evaluation. Number one, what is your company's goal of moving to the cloud? Reduction in capital expenditures, optimization of internal operations, preparation for new technical capabilities, modernization, cost savings, multiple things. Maybe your current infrastructure is at end of life, and it just really makes sense to modernize it and move it over to the cloud before you're dead in the water. Or maybe your goal is to reduce downtime for managing infrastructure and upgrades. What is the problem you are trying to solve? Is there a business requirement driving this, or maybe something else? Make sure you understand what the problem is you are trying to solve, and if that goal actually addresses that problem. Ultimately, your problems can drive a portion of your goals, but you may have additional ones. These items need to be determined upfront so the choices you make during this process aligns. They create value streams for your organization. Once you have your objectives, You can create a plan and KPIs toward those objectives, and then show how you met those at the end. This is our objective. This is the state at the beginning. This is the state at the end. It's hard to have project success if you don't define what your objectives are. This is a project. And if you've been working on projects for a while, you know how easy it is to go sideways and lose sight of your goals. Sometimes these goals will change a bit, and that's okay. But ultimately, your success will be measured by if you achieve clearly defined goals that you can apply metrics towards. Executive support. Many times, you will go into a migration project that is being driven by the top level. Maybe your CEO went to a conference or read some important articles, and if so, you are ahead of the game. Well, until you have to set expectations properly. But if you don't already have executive support, then you need to identify an executive sponsor, someone who is high up and can lead a cultural shift within your organization, a champion. Stakeholder buy-in. You need to identify and involve key stakeholders early in the process on both the business and IT side. Involvement and communication is key. People don't like change. Try telling a bunch of financial analysts that have been doing their job for over 20 years and have lived through multiple technology shifts. Try telling them they won't have Excel anymore. I promise you, it won't be pretty. Rather than focus on what you are taking away, focus on the change, on why the change is needed and what it gives them. How can you get their buy-in for your project while still being honest? If you don't have that executive support or stakeholder support, then you may need to do a little digging. What are your company's core values? What is the 5- and 10-year plan for business initiatives? How does moving to the cloud address these? At the department level, what are the primary goals and concerns from a technical perspective? How can moving to the cloud help this? Everyone's answer will not be the same, but look at how you can align key stakeholder needs with the goals of the C-suite. Building a business case that can address top concerns and how the cloud will help this is ideal for this situation. Team. The next thing we need to consider is what we will do in-house versus what we may have to pull a partner in for. For your internal team, what you first must determine is the different areas you will need a SME for and a good idea of what they need to know. Second, identify potential people, key people that you may have in-house to fulfill these roles. Ideally, you will have people in your organization from across many teams that you can assign to roles. Do you upskill? And is that enough? Or do you hire outside help? What gaps do you need to fill? And how will your org both fill and monitor those domain gaps? When possible, identify potential team members that either have the skills or can upskill. Build a skills readiness plan. Investing in your people is far cheaper than hiring outside help. Consultants are great. I know, I've been one. But there is no replacement for having in-house knowledge, particularly once those consultants have finished and walked out the door, potentially without much knowledge transfer. The people that will be maintaining and growing your systems need to have the skills. That said, in some cases, you definitely want to hire outside help. Maybe many of your team members are really spread thin, or the upskill process doesn't match the timeline. Then definitely bring in consultants. Common things for partners to be involved in. Strategy. This is help with defining all things such as business strategy, business cases, and technology strategies. Plan. This refers to support with discovery tasks, such as assessment of the digital estate and development of a cloud adoption plan. Ready. This describes support with landing zone tasks. Migrate. This is for all migration-related tasks. Innovate. This refers to when you need support for changes in your architecture. Govern. Tasks related to governance. And manage. Ongoing management post-migration tasks. Along the lines of consultants, help them help you. Does your company have specific standards or best practices that are specific to your industry or workflow? Share that with them. Share any and all documentations we talk about in this session. Documentation. Now we need to find out what we have regarding documentation. From the technical side, we need to look at what our current infrastructure looks like. What type of documentation do you have for your data estate and infrastructure? Where is your data? What does your data require for things like storage and memory? What are all the components that connect to what you want to move? If you don't know what your current infrastructure looks like, you need to determine how and who will document this for you. On the business side, what are your business requirements for your systems? Do you have regulatory requirements, SLAs mandating certain uptimes? What about other business requirement documents for security, compliance, backup, recovery point objectives, and recovery time objectives? And finally, have you previously tried to do a cloud migration? What documentation is left over from that? Is it current? What were some of the successes and some of the failures? Any lessons learned? You don't have to know everything at this point, but you do need to know, you do need to find out what you have and what you don't have. And if we're perfectly honest, what might be out of date. This is where you need an enterprise architect and some in-depth meetings with different departments. Communication is key to getting the documentation and finding out what you have, what you don't have, and what you may need down the road. Discovery. Digital estate. Understanding your digital estate at the beginning of your project will help you determine what to assess and migrate down the road. Even if you already think you know all the things you need to migrate, it's helpful to check out how all of the things may be connected. You need to identify your infrastructure, applications, and all the dependencies. You don't want any surprises. Don't just rely on old documentation. Azure Migrate has a discovery and assessment tool that can assist in this task, but there are certainly many other ways to acquire this information. You may have other third-party tools or internal processes that already gather this information for you. Just make sure it's up to date. The key takeaways here are: 1, identify the infrastructure, things like servers. 2, identify what apps do they use. This includes all of your SQL Server apps. 3, and identify dependencies that may have internally and across servers. Don't forget to include things like ports and networking. Data management. Now is the time to find out what documentation you have about your data. And this can be essential if you determine you need to move things in parts or if you have overlap in data that might be potentially consolidated. This will help you down the road when we get into some architectural decisions with the 5 R's. A quick summary of these terms. A data dictionary helps you to understand and trust data in databases better. A business glossary provides a common language for organization when it comes to business concepts and metrics. A data catalog helps you find, understand, trust, and collaborate on data all across. And data classification groups your data elements to make it easy to sort, retrieve, and store. Why are these things important for migration? First off, they're important just from a data governance perspective. But more than that, knowing this information up front can save you a lot of headaches down the road. You may have business requirements for some of your data to be labeled in a security context. Maybe you're dealing with highly classified government data, healthcare data, or HR data. Or you may find you have data type mismatches. And data catalogs often review hidden dependencies that you may not have known otherwise. All is not lost if you don't have all of this. Azure has some internal tools like Purview to assist with this, and there are plenty of third-party tools. If you're like me, you already carry around a script toolbox for the lifetime of your career. Some of those scripts from 20 years ago still work. And apart from the business glossary, there are so many free options and scripts out there that this should not be a showstopper for you. In addition to the previous items we mentioned for data management, I want to call out data lineage specifically. Data lineage gives you insight into how your data flows. It helps you understand how your data is connected and the impact of changes to your data, processes, and structure. affects the flow and quality of your data. There are a lot of tools that can help you with data lineage with various levels of sophistication. Long gone are the days where you must shift through a lot of Excel sheets to figure it all out. That's why graphical tools like Purview are really exciting for me. This is an image of Azure Purview, and I wanted to show you how granular it can get at the column level and how it travels through the various processes and databases. The column level feature is really, really nice. It's not necessary at this stage, but it is certainly helpful to you at the testing and troubleshooting phases. What you really need with your data lineage at this stage, and you can still see this in this graph, is how your data flows between resources, because this is a great way to discover things you may not have been aware of in your data flow process that you need to pull into your migration plan. Pilot project. If you haven't moved anything to the cloud previously that is related to your infrastructure, then consider having a much smaller pilot project, one that will give you a feel for all these steps, has a lower risk than your overall project. Maybe you have a database that is only used for a small app that is low risk if the migration doesn't go as expected. Try to keep your pilot project to applications with just a few dependencies. The goal of this is to A, help you understand the process, and B, get you a quick win that you can show to the stakeholders. You want one that is low risk, that is small enough to manage easily, but still large enough with a long enough duration to give you a good understanding of the processes involved. If you've already done this previously, then this is where you review what you've learned from your previous pilot project. Assess. Once you have done your due diligence with data management, that will give you an idea of the scope of your project. In order to properly identify your scope, you need to identify all your data sources that need to move. What can be moved in parts and what must move together? What type of data sources do you have? Is it just relational databases, files, multiple types? You have to know what all of your data sources are because you will need to decide which ones you move to the cloud and the different storage options that they may have. Often, data sources are not just one singular database or even just databases, so it's mandatory that they are all included in your scope. Lastly, assessment of criticality for what should be migrated first. You want to have something that shows benefit without causing catastrophe if it fails. Readiness. After you've completed your initial discovery, you should now have a good idea of the databases you are considering for migration to Azure SQL. You now want to identify migration blockers or compatibility issues. What do we mean by blockers and compatibility issues? I've listed a few here to give you an idea, but there are a lot. And some of these blockers may alter what Azure SQL offerings you choose, or they may simply signify additional steps you need to take to get your databases into readiness. For example, if you use linked server features and don't want to pull that data physically from its source into a database that needs access to it, then Azure SQL database is not going to be a good fit for you. Knowing these blockers and compatibility issues is essential before you migrate so you can make changes where needed. There are a couple different tools that are free to use from Microsoft that will give you this information. The Azure SQL Migration extension for Azure Data Studio is currently recommended by Microsoft, which gives you the added benefits of assisting in migration, right-sizing your databases based on workloads, and interacting with Azure Migrate. There's also the Data Migration Assistant tool. This acts similar, though you do have to specify your Azure SQL choice beforehand. It doesn't do a migration for SQL MI, but you can still upload your assessments to Azure Migrate and use the capabilities in there. Plus, it has the capability to do a SQL Server to SQL Server assessment migration, which may be helpful if you first want to update your version. After you run your readiness assessment, you may end up with a lot of different things you have to consider for your landing zone. If there are too many variable options, then consider weighting your needs to see what is most important and necessary. Do you need to control the operating system, or is it just that you really, really want to? What is the trade-off? You may have many dependencies between data sources, and if you do, to optimize your capabilities and cost savings, you should consider how does that infrastructure look in the cloud? Do all of your databases need to be managed instance, or can some be put in Azure SQL databases that require minimal management? If you have several databases, you don't have to choose only one Azure SQL option. Business requirements. Here is where you will be looking at those business requirement documents we talked about earlier. High availability and disaster recovery documents are often defined in recovery time objective and recovery point objective agreements. Knowing this is crucial in selecting the appropriate cloud storage tier. What about uptime? That's where you will look at your SLA agreements. Security. Do you have specific business requirements around security, and does it translate to cloud best practices? You certainly don't want a give them everything model because it's easier. Business requirements will often give you insight into what you need to do with regards to compliance. That compliance helps ensure that your company's data is protected and has the confidentiality, integrity, and availability required. What about backups? Do you have a requirement for how long you have to keep your backups? Can some go to a cheaper storage after a specified period? If you are going to Azure SQL VM or SQL MI, how do you want to store your backups? Speaking of storage, are you allowing for storage considerations for discovery and monitoring tools? All those log files are going to take up space, and some of that space is automatically allocated. Know how you're going to organize, compare, and plan for all of these items. Workloads. When preparing for a migration, you want to capture how your data behaves. Specifically, you want to be cognizant of what queries are important and representative of your business workload. That gives you an ideal workload to create a baseline. So how often and how long do you collect these workloads? The dreaded IT answer, it depends, because every business is different. Some orgs have the same processes day in and day out. Some are global and run at the same level 24/7. Some just run reports after a month-end data load process. What you really need to do is identify those peaks and non-peak periods. In our company, we have a mixed bag depending on the database and the project. So you need to ideally, A, talk to people that use the system, and B, verify that their interpretation of what is actually going on is correct. So what to capture? Trend lines and seasonal data is a good start. You want to know when your data is hit the hardest during a 24-hour period. Do all your users log on at 8 a.m. and start pulling direct query reports? Do you have an ETL process that operates in the middle of the night? These are the patterns you want to identify. What about seasonal data? Do you have month-end, quarter-end, and year-end type bursts you need to account for? Conversely to your daily trend workloads, with seasonal workloads, you may want to spread your capture of the performance metrics out a little more, so there's not as much noise. You don't need an every 20-second capture for these, but you probably need to keep the recordings much longer, potentially for a few years compared to a few months for your trend workloads. Ascertaining the pattern of your data and recording the performance metrics will not only be great as a comparison down the road, but also help you right-size your infrastructure. For example, if you're using the Data Migration Assistant, the SKU recommender will use your workloads to estimate vCores and data max size. Capture and review your baselines. When creating workloads, you want to make sure you have a baseline. Besides right-sizing your target landing zone, which is super important, what else do you want to capture baselines? To compare the performance of your workload in your landing zone with your original server. Everyone here has gotten the vague, oh, the system is slow speech with little to no detail attached to it. Without your baselines, you have no idea if your migration has helped with performance or in some cases hurt. And that makes it even harder to troubleshoot. With baselines, you can pinpoint if there's a single problem from a new poorly designed query, an overall system slowdown, or if Christy has just had way too much coffee this morning and thinks everything else is slow. What to collect? I've put some common metrics here, but some of them are really going to be prioritized based on what is important to your business. Assessing your risks. I cannot express this enough. Know your risks. Here's a small list of examples: disruptive downtime, loss of productivity, compromised data, loss of history or cross-project traceability. This can cause compliance or productivity risks, inability to use systems, infrastructure compatibility. Do you have an infrastructure that just doesn't work in the cloud? These are some of the risks you need to be aware of, and not just overall project risks, but individual category risks. What are your security risks? Not just unauthorized people accessing, but people that need to access things that can't. If you have multiple components that need to be considered to move, what's the risk? And if there's a high risk, do all of those have to move at once? What things stand out as a straight move versus a build back better? By assessing and documenting your risks, you are better able to address them. What about risks the other way? What are the risks of not moving to the cloud? Maybe you've been on an unstable server for a while that poses a big risk for your company. Once you know the risks, then you can justify the benefits. Architecture. Cloud or hybrid? This is where you need to determine, based on your previous assessments, are you moving everything to the cloud, moving things in parts, or do you expect to have an ongoing hybrid infrastructure? There are pros and cons to hybrid architecture, but most of the time it is an architecture adopted out of necessity. Maybe your infrastructure is too large and complicated to move all at once. Maybe your organization wants to reap some of the cost benefits and lower risks by putting specific things in the cloud first. Maybe you simply have some components that won't move to the cloud that are vital to your workflow. The discovery process of your digital estate, followed by your previous assessments, will help you determine the criticality of what needs to move together, the priority of that movement, and whether you need to be all in the cloud or hybrid. Which Azure SQL? Previously, we talked about getting assessments with tools, but often those tools come back with multiple recommendations, or maybe even some recommendation of things you need to change for certain Azure SQL offerings. You're going to need to determine which Azure SQL best fits your needs. Some orgs want to go to Azure SQL VM just as a first step to getting their data in the cloud, and then come back and switch to one of the past offerings. Some orgs want to go straight to Azure SQL Database to fully realize the benefits of the cloud right away. To make the proper choice for your organization, you need to know not only your current infrastructure needs, but also what that looks like in the future. Again, aligning business needs with the reality of what your systems technically require. Each Azure SQL option has limits. If I have a 500 gigabyte database, then my options are pretty open here. But if I need operating system level access, then really Azure SQL VM is my only option. It's also quite possible you may need to blend the different offerings. Maybe you have to use a linked server between two of your databases on two different instances. You also have a database in the mix of ETL that doesn't need that capability, and you don't want all the management overhead. In that case, you may want to use both Azure MI and SQL Database. Knowing the limits and benefits of each Azure SQL offering is important so you make the right choice for your data estate. Changes. Most of the time, we are not just moving one small database. What might need to change from an architecture standpoint? This is when we get into the 5 Rs: rehost, refactor, re-architect, rebuild, or replace. Starting at the bottom here with the least amount of effort: rehost. This is the standard lift and shift. You're basically just taking your current solution and migrating to the cloud in an Azure SQL VM solution. You still have complete control and compatibility as you did previously. Low risk with minimal changes to the architecture. Refactor. Take your on-prem stack and rewrite where needed to take advantage of and optimize for Azure PaaS offerings. This is the changes you need to consider when using the SQL MI PaaS offering. You may have some changes to your code, but by and large, you're going to have a lot of things stay the same. Re-architect. This is really about modernizing your infrastructure to reap the benefits of MS's Azure SQL Database PaaS offering, particularly if you have incompatibility or non-cloud native apps you use with the cloud. Rebuild. This is taking your existing stack and converting it to a PaaS option, Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL MI, and the level of the new code can vary depending if you choose Azure SQL Database or MI and what you need to do to get it there. Replace. With this option, you take your existing stack and convert it to a SaaS solution. This one requires the most amount of work because you're basically starting from scratch. Looking at your infrastructure, you need to decide and include in your plan how this applies to everything you need to migrate. If migrating several databases, you may need to blend several of these options. There are additional considerations that you will need to plan for that fall outside of the nice tool sets we've all used and seen. Some of these considerations are dictated by other choices you make, like which Azure SQL product you choose, but others don't really fall neatly into that category. Storage is a really good example. You may have additional backup considerations or the storage of log files generated from services related to your data platform, or even files from your old file share that is used in your ETL, ELT processes. With network access controls, depending on the Azure SQL products you choose, you will need knowledgeable staff setting these up so you don't accidentally expose your data to the world. Same with security. Does your third-party app even support Azure Active Directory? Do you need to set up a new domain server? Each company is different in what they need to look at and include, but make sure you address each of these categories in your planning and migration. Costs. Creating estimates. Using the cloud is a change in the thought on how you budget and pay for your infrastructure. It's about changing mindsets. Working on-prem and planning budgets for that is much different than pay-as-you-go models. You are switching from a capital expenditures model to an operating expenditures model. As such, you want to make sure you budget correctly. There are a lot of tools that can assist. Azure Pricing Calculator is a free web-based tool that you can use to build budgets. You can add each component of your migration and then customize it to what you have discovered and assessed earlier, including cost-saving options. If things change as you go through this process, you can always go back and alter your saved estimates. It's not glamorous and it's not fun, at least not to me, but it's something that needs to be thought about at the beginning and throughout the entire process. Tools. So here's a breakdown of common tools for costs. The Azure Pricing Calculator, which we just saw, it builds estimates for your migration. Azure's Total Cost of Ownership Calculator, TCO. It's another tool to estimate cost savings. You have the Azure Pricing Guide. It helps you to view detailed information for the pricing around any Azure service. Retail Rates Prices API is a programmatic way to get Azure retail prices for Azure services. You can also get various partner tool sets throughout the Azure marketplace and solution assessments. You can get those from a Microsoft's solutions assessment expert or qualified partner. Things that can cost you extra money. What about the things that aren't easily determined by the tools? Let's talk about some of those for a minute. Regions, a good example. Different regions can have different costs. This can increase your egress charges if you have a lot of data flowing between the regions. Next, make sure you determine the correct database and correct size. Many items in the data platform space are charged by allocation. Over-allocating resources in the cloud can dramatically increase costs. Also, be cognizant of spinning up servers unnecessarily, because if you create a SQL Server instance in the cloud and then don't use it, you'll still be charged. Third, know your thresholds and patterns for scaling. You no longer need to operate at 40 to 60% threshold before pulling all your tickets in for more space, more memory, more everything. You can run much higher thresholds and even incorporate auto-scaling events that trigger when they hit certain thresholds, like when you need to accommodate for, say, those pesky data load processes. Though be very careful with auto-scaling and monitoring, or you will end up with more costs. There may be times you need a burst of capacity, but other times the server runs completely dormant when it should be turned off. Those go back to the workloads we talked about earlier. Next, I mentioned egress with regions, but you need to be aware of all of the different things that can cause it. When possible, move components together in the cloud and preferably in the same region. Think about your high availability disaster recovery requirements and how they can affect costs with that egress. Lastly, network costs. Bandwidth charges are often overlooked, so make sure not to forget about these. This is primarily an issue with hybrid infrastructures. Ways to save. Here I've broken this out in 3 categories: programs, infrastructure, and resource tasks. Starting with programs. Visual Studio subscribers get discounts. An example is using Azure offers such as dev test pricing. This provides lower rates for dev test environments, even more cost savings with dev test environments using reserved instances. Subscribers can also get individual monthly credits that run between $50 and $200 per user per month. You have 100 users getting just the $50 a month credit, that ends up being $60,000 a year. At the 200 mark, it becomes $240,000 a year. Azure Hybrid Benefit. With software assurance enabled SQL Server licenses, you can get a large discount on SQL database using the vCore pricing tier and with SQL Managed Instance. Changing to Azure Hybrid Benefit does not require any downtime, and you can run both the original source and the landing source zone databases for up to 180 days. The Azure Hybrid Benefit even has a calculator to help determine savings, and it can be pretty massive. Azure reservations for SQL VM, SQL MI, and SQL databases vCore gives additional cost-saving options. Things like reserve capacity pricing for data services. You commit to 1 or 3-year term for Azure SQL Database, Azure Cosmos DB, and Azure Synapse Analytics. You can scale up, down within a performance tier and region with vCore flexibility. If needed, you can always change your reservation to another region, deployment type, or performance tier. Reserved VMs. For migrations that also require VM, you can get huge discounts with Azure Reserved VM instances. Again, you have 1 to 3-year terms and instance size flexibility. Using the Azure Migration and Modernization Program can save on costs if you qualify, not only because of the cost-saving offers you can get through the program, but also because of the expertise and training that comes with the program could indirectly help you save. Moving to infrastructure. Target regions. This is when you create assessments in different regions to see if a specific region saves you money. It's not always the region you're in. Savings with HADR free secondaries. SQL Database's hyperscale tier allows HA named secondary replicas for read scale-out at no license cost. Software assurance also lets you implement free passive secondaries using SQL VM. Burstable Azure machines. That's exactly as it sounds. Savings by scaling when you need it. And VM uptimes, shutting off those servers when they are not in use. Resource task. One of the number 1 things you can do for costs, as we said before, is creating baselines to right-size your cloud resources. Cloud governance, using resource organization to perform efficient cost analysis. Limiting who's allowed to make the decisions of clicking that button that'll spin up 10 servers, right? Routinely doing cost analysis to ensure you know what is going on in your infrastructure. Training your staff to understand what costs money and putting security policies in place so that only the staff that understands those concepts can make changes. That would cost a lot. And finally, reevaluating architecture, removing waste and looking for underutilized resources. Migrate. Planning. At this point, you've done all your pre-planning and evaluation, all your discovery. You've done assessments, picked your architecture, and really dug deep into what your costs are. Now what? Now is when you pull everything together to create a plan. Planning is the most important thing you do with migrating your assets. Microsoft has a really easy tool called the Strategic Migration Assessment and Readiness tool, SMART for short. Haven't already looked at it for a migration project, then make sure to check it out. It lets you double check the categories you see up here and then gives you the option to drill down into each one to get very specific information. For example, the migration plan category here will take you to a Microsoft Learn page that takes you step by step through things like prioritizing workloads, establishing iterations and release plans, and estimating timelines. You still, of course, are going to need a project manager, getting your technical experts together to make sure everything has been included. Then decide the sequence for your migration and modernization steps. Review scope and its business impact. Make sure everyone is on board. You want to plan your migration as a series of iterations and plan around major business events. Year-end closing is probably not going to be a great time to start moving stuff all around. So Melody Zacharias has some really fantastic presentations that talk about the various migration tools. If you're looking for detailed information into these tools, then I highly recommend you try catching when she does this session or looking at her videos online, because she does a really great deep dive into them. I'm just going to lightly touch on them here. Azure Migrate uses DMA for databases only scenario, can assist in assessing and moving an entire data solution. MAP, the Microsoft Assessment and Planning tool, very, very similar, although Microsoft does recommend using the Azure Migrate instead, but you're still going to get a boatload of information from either of those two options. Azure Database Migration Services uses Azure SQL Migration Extension for the Azure Data Studio, can use for assessment and/or migration. It's for Azure only. Data Migration Assistant checks for database compatibility issues and feature parity, can check for Azure or SQL on-prem. The source server can be SQL Server or AWS RDS for SQL Server. Can also work for integration services for SQL Server to Azure SQL databases or Azure MI. You can upload the results to Azure Migrate, and the Database Experimentation Assistant. This helps evaluate your target SQL Server for a specific workload. Helps you find queries with compatibility errors, degraded queries and query plans, and other workload comparison data. And finally, the SQL Server Migration Assistant, used for migrating to SQL Server or Azure SQL from Access, DB2, MySQL, Oracle, and SAP ASE. Just as you have many different tools to do your migration, you have different methods. Some of these methods are actually used by the tools, but many of them you can just manually do yourself. I'm definitely violating design rules by putting all of these up here. But the point is that there are many ways for you to deploy your migration, and knowing and documenting what methods you are using should be part of your migration strategy, particularly in case something goes wrong. Testing. Test your workload on your source and target. This will not only give you performance checks, but it will also provide additional checks such as connectivity. Go through all the queries you do on your on-prem environment and run them in your new environment. Do you see any unusual errors that you run in your workload? Compare your baselines. Hopefully you aren't getting sick of me saying this. By doing this, you can see if your performance is the same. Are you getting the same or better performance? And if not, why? Check for connection. Do you have connection tests? Do a sample test in your applications, reports, etc., showing that you can connect. What about different roles? Hopefully you haven't done a security overhaul at the same time. You want to make sure that different roles can connect as expected, and that any special items you have with security that may be different in the cloud, linked server, credentials, etc., are still connecting as should. For data validation, you're going to want to compare data from your source server to your target landing zone. If you don't have a tool that automates this, you can easily create queries for the top row items on this list, throw them into a spreadsheet, and use this spreadsheet compare tool, or whatever your favorite way is to do comparisons are. Let's quickly review these items you need to compare. Row counts. Get them for all your tables and views. Columns that have calculations performed on them. Make sure that the sum of table X column A on the source server equals the sum of table X column A on the landing zone database. You are looking at columns you can perform sum, average, etc. calculations on. Basic database dictionary. Again, you are doing a comparison here. You are looking for changes in things like data type, nulls, defaults, constraints. Are there any differences? And finally, checking sample reports and stored procedure results to make sure that when all the variables are the same, you get the same results. You want your reports, stored procedure, proc tests, repeatable across environments. Post-migration. Post-migration test. Some of these items you did during the testing phase, but you are going to want to do additional checks once all these are completed. First and foremost, you want to check the status of the database or the instance in the Azure portal through the Azure portal or through the Azure command line interface. Next, make sure you take the time to review the deployment details and activity log for failures or active issues. For Azure SQL Managed Instance, you can also check the error log like on-prem or Azure SQL VM. You want to confirm you can connect, confirm the network is configured properly, and use a tool like SSMS or Azure Data Studio. Another important task is decommission existing on-premises infrastructure. This process is going to vary by company, but one of your goals should be to reduce your IT overhead and the time you spend managing your infrastructure. Make sure you have a reliable process in place for decommissioning the old infrastructure. The last thing you want to find out is that people are entering information into the old systems that do not have active monitoring occurring. Lastly, document. And for gosh sake, please put them in some sort of shared repository, accessible to others and in a sensible way. And even include the dreaded lessons learned. We've reached the end. So you've got a thumbs up from everyone and you are all done, right? Nope. You still have to measure, monitor, and plan. Monitoring and cross-checking with KPIs. Your workloads don't stop. Build in a way to monitor them routinely, to look for anomalies, changes, as well as ongoing work in the future that show potential faults in your original design. Continuously check to see if your performance has changed, and if so, does this affect when dependencies stop and start? If my ETL jumps 2 hours in duration, but I have my data refreshes set to start at the end of my old duration, I need to look at that. Hopefully fixing the performance problem, or if not, changing those dependency start times. Monitor prior seasonal workloads to verify performance over time. No matter how much you test, there may be use cases that you weren't aware of that later shows a problem. To do all of this, you need to have an ongoing monitoring plan. Make sure it includes alerting for specific events like exceeding a performance threshold. Monitor to make sure you're not underutilizing your resources. This will verify that you are not only right-sized now, but in the future. Create queries and easy-to-use dashboards to support the requirements of each role in your IT departments. And finally, last but not least, assess and plan for potential additional moderation, because this won't be your last rodeo. Resources, real quick, because I see that we're coming up on time. Where's my checklist? We did it. So here's a link. Yeah, this is a thing about checklists, and I'm big on checklists. So I'm putting my link to GitHub. I will be updating this checklist over time as I get feedback from people like you and items I need to include. So please do, let me know whether I missed something or if I need to include some more information. I've added some of my favorite resources here to get you started, but I will say that if you're viewing this a few years later, there's a chance that the links have moved, especially the Microsoft ones. Cough, cough. I'm not going to go through all of these here because they're really just a reference for you later. Here's some other migration presentations that I really enjoy. And again, this is something I'll probably add to over time because I think I missed putting in a bunch here. So I'll probably put a resource list for this in the GitHub as well. And lastly, feedback. It helps me to get better, which in turn helps me to help you. So please, please, please provide some feedback because I will take it to heart and improve these as needed.